Montparnasse was a handsome fellow, but Gavroche was a tease. "Seriously," demanded Montparnasse, "how do you like me so?" The sound of his voice was different also. In a twinkling, Montparnasse had become unrecognizable. "Oh! do play Porrichinelle for us," exclaimed Gavroche. The two children, who had not been listening up to this point, being occupied themselves in thrusting their fingers up their noses, drew near at this time, and stared at Montparnasse with dawning joy and admiration. Unfortunately, Montparnasse was troubled. He laid his hand on Gavroche's shoulder and said to him, emphasizing his words:— "Listen to what I tell you, boy. If I were on the square, with my dog, my knife, and my wife, and if you were to squander 10 sous on me, I wouldn't refuse to work. But this isn't Shrove Tuesday." This odd phrase produced a singular effect on the gamin. He wheeled round hastily, darted his little sparkling eyes about him with profound attention, and perceived a police sergeant standing with his back to them a few paces off. Gavroche allowed an "Ah, good!" to escape him, but immediately suppressed it, and shaking Montparnasse's hand, "Well, good evening," said he, "I'm off to my elephant with my brats. Supposing that you should need me some night, you can come and hunt me up there. I lodge on the entresol. There is no porter. You will inquire for Monsieur Gavroche." "Very good," said Montparnasse. And they parted, Montparnasse betaking himself in the direction of the Grève, and Gavroche towards the Bastille. The little one of 5, dragged along by his brother, who was dragged by Gavroche, turned his head back several times to watch Porrichinelle as he went. The ambiguous phrase, by means of which Montparnasse had warned Gavroche of the presence of the policeman, contained no other talisman than the assonance dig, repeated 5 or 6 times in different forms. This syllable, dig, uttered alone or artistically mingled with the words of a phrase, means, "Take care, we can no longer talk freely." There was, besides, in Montparnasse's sentence, a literary beauty which was lost upon Gavroche. That is, "Mon dog, ma dague, et ma digue," a slang expression of the Temple, which signifies "my dog, my knife, and my wife," greatly in vogue among clowns and the red tails, in the great century when Molière wrote and Callot drew. 20 years ago, there was still to be seen in the southwest corner of the Place de la Bastille, near the basin of the canal, excavated in the ancient ditch of the fortress prison, a singular monument, which has already been effaced from the memories of Parisians, and which deserved to leave some trace, for it was the idea of a member of the Institute, the general-in-chief of the army of Egypt. We say monument, although it was only a rough model, but this model itself, a marvellous sketch, the grandiose skeleton of an idea of Napoleon's, which successive gusts of wind have carried away and thrown on each occasion, still further from us, had become historical, and had acquired a certain definiteness which contrasted with its provisional aspect. It was an elephant 40 feet high, constructed of timber and masonry, bearing on its back a tower which resembled a house, formerly painted green by some dauber, and now painted black by heaven, the wind, and time. In this deserted and unprotected corner of the place, the broad brow of the colossus, his trunk, his tusks, his tower, his enormous crupper, his 4 feet, like columns, produced at night, under the starry heavens, a surprising and terrible form. It was a sort of symbol of popular force. It was sombre, mysterious, and immense. It was some mighty, visible phantom, one knew not what, standing erect beside the invisible spectre of the Bastille. Few strangers visited this edifice, no passer-by looked at it. It was falling into ruins. Every season the plaster which detached itself from its sides formed hideous wounds upon it. The Adils, as the expression ran in elegant dialect, had forgotten it ever since 1814. There it stood in its corner, melancholy, sick, crumbling, surrounded by a rotten palisade, soiled continually by drunken coachmen. Cracks meandered athwart its belly, a lath projected from its tail. Tall grass flourished between its legs, and, as the level of the place had been rising all around it for a space of 30 years, by that slow and continuous movement which insensibly elevates the soil of large towns, it stood in a hollow, and it looked as though the ground were giving way beneath it. It was unclean, despised, repulsive, and superb. Ugly in the eyes of the bourgeois, melancholy in the eyes of the thinker. There was something about it of the dirt which is on the point of being swept out, and had something of the majesty which is on the point of being decapitated. As we have said, at night, its aspect changed. Night is the real element of everything that is dark. As soon as twilight descended, the old elephant became transfigured. He assumed a tranquil and redoubtable appearance in the formidable serenity of the shadows. Being of the past, he belonged to the night, and obscurity was in keeping with his grandeur. This rough, squat, heavy, hard, austere, almost misshapen, but assuredly majestic monument, stamped with a sort of magnificent and savage gravity, has disappeared, and left to reign in peace a sort of gigantic stove, ornamented with its pipe, which has replaced the sombre fortress with its 9 towers, very much as the bourgeoisie replaces the feudal classes. It is quite natural that a stove should be the symbol of an epoch in which a pot contains power. This epoch will pass away. People have already begun to understand that, if there can be a force in a boiler, there can be no force except in the brain. In other words, that which leads and drags on the world is not locomotives, but ideas. Harness locomotives to ideas. That is well done, but do not mistake the horse for the rider. At all events, to return to the Place de la Bastille, the architect of this elephant succeeded in making a grand thing out of plaster. The architect of the stove has succeeded in making a pretty thing out of bronze. This stovepipe, which has been baptized by a sonorous name, and called the Column of July, this monument of a revolution that miscarried, was still enveloped in 1832 in an immense shirt of woodwork, which we regret for our part, and by a vast plank enclosure which completed the task of isolating the elephant. It was towards this corner of the place, dimly lighted by the reflection of a distant street lamp, that the gamin guided his 2 brats. The reader must permit us to interrupt ourselves here, and to remind him that we are dealing with simple reality, and that 20 years ago the tribunals were called upon to judge, under the charge of vagabondage and mutilation of a public monument, a child who had been caught asleep in this very elephant of the Bastille. This fact noted, we proceed. On arriving in the vicinity of the Colossus, Gavroche comprehended the effect which the infinitely great might produce on the infinitely small, and said, "Don't be scared, infants." Then he entered through a gap in the fence into the elephant's enclosure, and helped the young ones to clamber through the breach. The 2 children, somewhat frightened, followed Gavroche without uttering a word, and confided themselves to this little providence in rags, which had given them bread and promised them a shelter. There, extended along the fence, lay a ladder, which by day served the labourers in the neighbouring timber yard. Gavroche raised it with remarkable vigour, and placed it against one of the elephant's forelegs. Near the point where the ladder ended, a sort of black hole in the belly of the Colossus could be distinguished. Gavroche pointed out the ladder and the hole to his guests, and said to them, "Climb up and go in." The 2 little boys exchanged terrified glances. "You're afraid, brats!" exclaimed Gavroche. And he added, "You shall see." He clasped the rough leg of the elephant, and in a twinkling, without deigning to make use of the ladder, he had reached the aperture. He entered it as an adder slips through a crevice and disappeared within, and an instant later the 2 children saw his head, which looked pale, appear vaguely on the edge of the shadowy hole, like a wan and whitish spectre. "Well," he exclaimed, "climb up, young uns. You'll see how snug it is here. Come up, you."